Hello, everybody, and I'm very happy to be here and maybe share some lessons learned with you on cloud migrations. Just a quick bit about myself. Well, I guess we should address the elephant in the room. The answer to both of your questions are yes. I am extremely tall, and the roof is very short in here. So I'm about 6'5", and this roof is a little under 7 foot. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, I'm going to go through and tell you some stuff. I really hope I can get this into 15 minutes. I'm going to watch the clock very heavily. And if we don't do it, Emma has told you that we're going to have some Q&A at the end. Also, feel free to look me up on LinkedIn. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to communicate with you there. So to get things started, my name is Cody Chandler. I have been in the technology industry for a little over 20 years. I've done every job in the industry. I've done tech support. I did systems administration. Linux stuff. I went into network engineering. I've done everything from building startups, built the first privately owned manned spaceship, which is now Virgin Galactic. And from there, we've done startups. We went through and exited startups. I really enjoyed this kind of like interim CTO, fixing processes from ideas that have gone through and caught. They went from a neat idea to a scalable business, and that transformation is where you're going to see a lot of this in cloud. But with this startup, my wife went through and said, you know, you're traveling too much, you're not home enough. I would be in Miami or Manhattan or Atlanta or Vancouver. She said it's probably time for you to get a grown-up job. Well, that didn't sound like very much fun to me to move into this like clunky corporate world. But I happened to stumble across a place called LegalZoom. And LegalZoom was very enterprisey, very clunky. They were doing about 2-4 releases a week, and with this 2 to 4 releases a week, there were a lot of issues. They were having problems with configuration management, these type of things. And they needed to increase their velocity. By the time I left LegalZoom, which was about 3.5 years later, we were doing in upwards of 300 to 400 releases a day. And so that sounds pretty substantial. How do you get to that? And these are some of the things that I'll talk to you about today. And one of the big ones I talk about sounds like a management jargon. And it's a lens that I ask everybody that works with me to use. And it's simple, repeatable, and promotable. One of the problems that we had at LegalZoom was that we had a number of different Jenkins jobs. And all of these Jenkins jobs were between 1,000 and 3,000 lines apiece. They were all very heavily catered to each application and not... They were definitely snowflakes, right? So we didn't have the ability to kind of parameterize or reuse these things. So any new application would require a huge lift on the left side, right, for your DevOps team to go through and figure out how to build these things. So we needed to go through and move into a shared library pattern. When we moved into the shared library pattern, they were like, okay, so we're going to take one of these jobs that builds an API and we'll parameterize it. And then from there, no, I'm sorry, I don't have any slides. To go through and move into this, we needed to not only take and say this is how we build an API, but we needed to parameterize it. There's a bunch of reusable functionality that you would use if you're building an API, if you're building a React module, if you're building an Angular app. So from here, we needed to go through and say, each piece that we build, we turn into an artifact, we push to Artifactory, right? We need to have that functionality reusable over and over again. And then the last step of this is how do we go through and make sure that we don't have a separate build for dev versus a release? And how do we make sure that we can promote through these things where we abstract the configuration and make sure that each of these are configurable for each of the environments? This becomes something like, as we start parameterizing this, you get a lot of people pushing back on you. I don't understand why we would need to have this layer of parameterization. Why does it have to be this, specific? Well, eventually you want to get to a point where you don't care where it goes. When I started at LegalZoom, we were all on-prem. We needed to go through and make sure that as we were building out these functions, we weren't just caring about a list of servers or places that we would put things on-prem, but what happens if we wanted to go through and start migrating to cloud? And we needed to plan for that very far on the left so that it wasn't a question that we had to address when we decided to go through and migrate into Kubernetes and into AWS. This kind of brings me up to my next point, which is this idea of busy versus effective. And everybody will tell you how busy they are. And we don't have time to do this, right? We don't have time to go through and parameterize this way. We don't have time to go through and rewrite these jobs. And there's that old saying, you may not have time to do it right, but you'll always make time to do it over. And so I try to explain to people, I say, when you're very busy, and I can appreciate that about you, and I appreciate your dedication to the company, and that you're trying your best to go through and get all of these tasks done. But if you were to leave a company, no one ever goes through and says, man, I'm going to miss Cody. He was always very busy, right? They're going to miss you because you were effective. You were able to go through and transition from something that required a lot of work and a lot of effort and Herculean lifts to now more of a easy, simple process. And so by doing this, you'll win more friends. It'll take you a little bit longer, but your process is going to go so much better. The other point that I talk about a lot is consumable services. And this kind of really depends upon the cloud that you're using. So if you look at the difference between like an AWS versus GCP, AWS has done a very good job of a ClickOps ability to just turn up a service and start leveraging it. Things like Kafka, Kinesis, Airflow, any of these things that you want, you can basically just turn it on, give it a couple parameters, and start leveraging it right away. It gets a little bit more complicated when you move into things such as GCP, because these services aren't as easy to just turn on and get going. But we seem to miss a thing when people want to go through and use something like a Kafka. We go through, we can spin it up, we can make it available to engineering or to DevOps. But once we do that, we're missing a step, because it still requires SMEs to be able to go through and configure the service, right? We have it stood up, we have it there. How are you creating new topics and ACLs? From here, we went through and started introducing Kafka GitOps, but it was late. The definition of done didn't have this configuration put into it. The service was turned up, people were leveraging it, but the management of this required a full-time SME to go through and manage this. It also required a number of tickets to come in so that you could turn up a new topic or ACL in dev. And then how did we promote it? These next stages all become very convoluted and time-consuming. These are things that you don't think about when you first spin up a service. I want to use Kafka. Okay, you want to use Kafka. Well, how do we go through and maintain this? And how do we go through and make it easily consumable so that a dev can go through and make a commit into a repository and spin up their topics and ACLs versus having to go through and get a ticket assigned to an SME to bring these things up, to then get the ticket back to these people. It's a great way to increase velocity and something that is kind of missed. Trying to think if that leads me into the next point here of cloud, which is your maturity level of actually being able to bring up resources. The first thing is when you get introduced to cloud and you go take your training for GCP or AWS, you'll see there's a lot of ClickOps involved. And people will tell you right away that this ClickOps is not scalable and we need to move into infrastructure as code. So the second step is we move into infrastructure as code and we take all of those clicks that we did and we take those clips and we put them into a YAML or JSON file of some sort, and we apply this with Terraform or something of the like to apply your IAC. But these are still very unique snowflakes, right? The next step from here is we need to go through and we need to build modules that are easily reusable, things that we can call and we can reference again, which is, I want a bucket, right? You should only have to worry about naming your bucket. There should be some parameters that are associated underlying that will allow you to reuse this code, know your landing zones, and be able to launch these over and over again. The last step of this maturity, which is we're not quite to, is understanding of the metadata collection from your cloud provider, such as GCP or AWS. Eventually, you can get to a point where if you're parameterizing things correctly, no one has to know about subnets or VPCs or any of these things. You should be able to go through and collect this information from your cloud provider via metadata and have that metadata inform your decisions as to where you go. So this is kind of your next steps of where you get to go for a cloud maturity process. Trying to think, there's a ton of information that I want to keep going, but I'm burning through my time. So the last thing is that with that said, we need to go through and take larger swings. a lot of times we're, again, trying to go through with this busy thing and just getting things done, getting it off my plate, clearing the tickets. What we should be doing is figuring out why this ingress of tickets is coming in. And with this ingress of tickets coming in, what are the ones that we can go through and try to build modules around so that we can empower engineering or empower DevOps to be able to do these things where we're not accountable for the spinning up of these processes. And how you have to do that is basically go through and try to figure out, like, what is the optimum scenario? What is the biggest swing that you can take in order to make everyone's life easier? And then break this apart into some smaller iterative goals that have to have tangible outcomes in shorter amounts of time. We can't say in 6 months or a year, I'm going to give you this amazing thing. We need to figure out, how do we go through and start delivering pieces of this, right? And building things out in pieces of this in very short amount of time. Well, this requires looking at things through new patterns and using tools that you wouldn't necessarily use. Again, this Kafka GitOps is something that's fresh on my brain. But the Kafka GitOps is a single state file that can be applied towards an environment or cluster. Well, how do you get there if you want to be able to break this apart into microservices? So we ended up using the ability to generate these state files through patterns that you wouldn't necessarily think of when you're talking about Kafka or GitOps in general, which is leveraging things such as Helm, leveraging Kustomize to kind of build these state files per environment. And again, this leads me to the last point that I will give you on my way out. And I was trying to explain this to people about using different patterns and using different tools to accomplish the things that we want to do. And the adoption of this, when you're going through and trying to evangelize or change this, is hard to explain or hard to get adoption. And so the problem is you've got to keep people from falling victim to the momentum of the way that things were done in the past. We've always done it this way. You're coming in new, you don't understand why we have to do things this way. We have to get out of that cycle. The idea is, if we don't change, we know exactly where we're going to be in 6 months. We know exactly where we're going to be in a year, and that's right here. You're going to be dealing with those same problems over and over again. So the quote that I'll leave you with was from an interview from Lex Friedman talking with Elon Musk. And they were talking about manufacturing, building spaceships and cars, and how do you do this, right? There's been a way that it's always been done, but we have to change this in order to make it go faster, build velocity, momentum. And Elon said, just as a function of inertia, people will want to use the same tools and methods that they're familiar with. That's what they'll do by default. But this will lead to an outcome of things that can be made with those tools and methods, but is unlikely to be the platonic ideal of a perfect product, which means we have to switch the way that we look at things. We have to switch the tools and the patterns to which we're familiar with in order to build velocity and momentum.